Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I want to talk about the Schielhau. Not the low Schielhau, but the high Schielhau. And specifically I want to talk about the difference between the two. In my last video I talked about the low Schielhau, which you generally use for the purposes of taking your tip and planting it in your opponent's chest while defending yourself from an Oberhau. The high Schielhau, I believe, can do basically the exact same thing. So first we're going to watch the clip. Classic high Schielhau, if anyone's ever seen one before. But what I want to talk about is the differences in targeting, in the reason why you use this one, and some of the pros and cons that this particular version has. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is that you're going to start in thumb grip, similar to how you're going to start with a low Schielhau, where the low Schielhau would primarily be about taking that tip and planting it right in your opponent's shoulder line. This high Schielhau is about basically taking your non-dominant edge, your short edge, and basically dropping it down onto their inside shoulder or on top of their head. In this particular case, it comes right down into the face or maybe a little bit onto the other side shoulder. Now, the reason why high Schielhaus are a little bit tougher than low Schielhaus is primarily because our cross guards, if we don't have rings on our longswords, do not protect our hands when we're in this particular position. If you look right here, the cross guard is facing directly vertical up and down. And what that means is that the hands on either side are completely unprotected. The only thing that saves you from getting hit on the hands or even really hit on the head from a slightly different angle is the fact that when you start your high Schielhau, you cross from the right side or the dominant side of your body to the non-dominant side. It's not super easy to see in this picture, but basically you cross from having the sword directly in front of your right shoulder to having it in front of your left. And that crossing motion is what's supposed to deflect your opponent's blade out of the way and keep you safe. But there's a problem. As I've said many times, we have floppy swords, and the flat side of your sword isn't a great tool for deflecting other people's cuts, because rather than deflect and properly push energy and momentum into your opponent's sword, it sort of just deforms around it. And what that means is that 9 times out of 10 when you're trying this high Schielhau, what's going to happen is you're going to parry basically with the flat, and in the process of crossing your body line, their sword is going to drop from the point of contact directly onto your hands. Or at least it would if you have your cross guard completely vertical. If it's not vertical, it'll go into the cross guard. So this is the first pro and con of the high Schielhau. Because of the directness that it goes towards your opponent's head, it's very good for getting over the guard of someone who, instead of throws an Oberhau at your head, tries to Zorn halfway through. If you want to imagine you're throwing an Oberhau and you realize you're going to get hit, and you sort of pivot halfway through and try to cut the angle into your opponent's sword, that's what most people do when they realize they're about to be hit with something. And that is effectively turning an Oberhau into a Zorn in an attempt to save your own life. What the high Schielhau does is it raises the point of contact of the blades so that the strong and the tip are basically at the same level, kind of like with a Schielhau. And what that means is that if you attempt to pull your hands in and cut the angle into the Zorn, you're going to hit further down on their blade than you want to. If 2 people Oberhau right at each other, they're going to hit mid to mid. But if you raise up the back end of your sword and your hands and lower your tip, what that does is it creates an angle where the further out, the weaker part of a person's blade is going to hit the stronger part of yours. And what that does is it really helps with the leverage of pushing someone out of the way. But again, it's not perfect. We have floppy swords. Depending on where it is your opponent's really trying to hit you, how much emphasis they put on it, and whether or not they try to save themselves, high Schielhaus tend to have problems that low Schielhaus don't. And the other problem that I think is most prominent is that you don't hit your intended target. Now, the sources tell you that more or less what you should be trying to do is throw a short edge cut downwards on your opponent's inside shoulder. So if you're right-handed, you're throwing it at their right shoulder on the left side of where you're facing. And the reason you do that is because when somebody meets you in the middle, instead of actually dropping the cut onto their shoulder, what generally happens is the second the blades meet, it pushes it a little bit to the left, and it changes the target from the right shoulder to the top of the head. So you're throwing that short edge cut down, you're scalping the top of their head as they push their blade inadvertently into their own head, and you get a nice little bonk. The problem is that if you miss this cut, there is no thrust that has stopped your momentum, which means you're going to end up in this position here, where the blades are probably going to make hand contact, or at least strong-to-strong contact, and now you're in a very close bind. Whereas if you miss a thrust, you would have something similar, but if you landed it in the unintended target, the thrust would prevent them from moving forward. So imagine for a second that you successfully get your high Schielhau off. There's still nothing stopping their momentum. This is going to be your end point no matter what. So if you're going to throw high Schielhaus, you absolutely have to be prepared for this situation. You have to know that even if you land your high Schielhau, nothing is going to really stop them from throwing an afterblow. And that's where I personally prefer the low Schielhau. But in this exact same situation, the high Schielhau can perform the exact same function, have a slightly different target, and offer some of the same sorts of protections. All right, that's going to be it. If you'd like to see your own footage featured on the channel, feel free to send me an email at HEMAFightBreakdowns@gmail.com, and I hope to see you next time.